Hey guys, this is Rob of Rule of Two Review. Welcome back to the channel. I hope you are having a fantastic day. And today I'm going to finally discuss more in detail my feelings about a very divisive topic surrounding the Nintendo Switch 2, which by the way is now officially less than 2 weeks away from releasing, which feels absolutely absurd and crazy, but is super, super exciting. And I know there'll be a lot of back and forth in the comments. Again, divisive topic. People have strong opinions on both sides, as do I. But I've put this off for far too long. It is time to talk about game key cards. Of course, we all know at this point what game key cards are, right? For the Switch 2, it's Nintendo's version of trying to marry the idea of a physical copy of a game with a digital copy of a game by releasing cartridges, cards, game key cards for a game that you might buy. And to be fair, this is pretty much all relegated to third parties right now. This is by choice from the developer. No indication that Nintendo is going to be using game key cards, but we're seeing a lot of third-party developers use the game key card, right? So the idea is the game key card, you can it's a cartridge, you plug it into your Switch 2, and the game is not actually on the card. It actually has to download from the internet the game to your console and can only be accessed when that card is in the console. So it feels like it's not truly a physical game. However, the cards can be plugged into any Switch 2 at any time, and as long as it downloads the game with the card, you can have that game playable on any Switch 2 at any time, to the point that they can be lent to people, people can borrow them, and you can resell them and trade them in and buy and sell used copies. So that's where it marries the idea of a physical and a digital version of a game. So again, we all know this isn't a surprise to anyone now. With 2 weeks to go, I think we're all pretty aware of what the game key cards are. And like I said, very divisive, and if you know me, or if you've seen even any of my very recent videos, you know this about me. I am a staunch supporter and defender of physical media and of physical gaming. This includes for movies. I have a gigantic Blu-ray movie collection, and I'm always buying new ones. And this definitely includes games. I'm buying physical games for my Switch, my PS5, and yes, even my Xbox Series X. I think physical gaming should always exist and always be supported as an option, alongside people who like to buy their games digital, or people who rely on subscription services like Game Pass and PSN, stuff that I do not use. I think that basically all different kinds of gamers should be supported forever. The physical gaming market should never go away, because then you're denying a portion of gamers and a portion of your consumer, like me, who prefers and in many cases will only buy and play their games if they're available physically. Now, something a lot of people have mentioned in the past, and I want to make sure to touch on it a little bit here as well, is that Nintendo is not the only or first company to do this with the game key cards. Right now, what we're seeing with third-party games being announced for the Switch 2 is absolutely a larger volume of these kinds of releases than we've seen for other companies. But make no mistake, for the PS5 and the Xbox Series X, there are games that have released with physical discs that themselves require you to download basically the entire game from the internet to your PlayStation or to your Xbox. And just like the game key cards, the disc of these games can be put into any PS5 or Xbox at any time, downloads the game, and then suddenly you're playing the game. And they can also be bought and traded in and resold and sold and bought as used copies, just like the game key cards will be able to. So it has existed prior to Nintendo and the Switch 2. This is not brand new. But again, it's happening to a very large volume because Nintendo has made one specific mistake that I absolutely hate, that is kind of forcing the hand of these third-party companies to rely heavily on these very cheap game key cards. And that mistake is that, as far as we understand, for the Switch 2, the only size of cartridge that Nintendo is making available are the 64 gig cartridges. So for a really small game that a third-party company might be making, they might only need like an 8 gig cartridge, which would save them significantly on the price of manufacturing their game physically, and they could release it that way. But Nintendo is only making the largest and most expensive card available, which means a company that doesn't need most of that 64 gigs for their game, why would they spend the extra money to use the expensive cartridge and potentially lose money by selling their very small, simple game physically? And so it's forcing their hand to instead rely on the super cheap game key cards, which, if anything, allows them to make something physically, so that part's good. But they're also then not making games that are completely on the cartridge, right? So it's very messy, it's very confusing, and I think that this would all be solved if Nintendo just made a variety of Switch 2 cartridges available to developers so that they can fit different sized games on their cartridges. But they're not doing that, and so the game key card we're seeing being used heavily. In the weeks leading up to the Switch 2's launch, we're seeing it being used heavily by third-party companies to save money because the 64 gig cartridges are very expensive. So I think that that is Nintendo's big mistake here. That being said, now I want to talk about my complicated feelings about the game key cards. And again, they're complicated because I am one of those people, and I even have a platform on YouTube and on Twitter and on Blue Sky where I'm making videos or I'm making posts and tweets about how I feel about stuff and sharing pictures of the new games and movies that I buy. I'm somebody with a platform and an audience who is constantly preaching the gospel of physical gaming and physical media. My complicated feelings about game key cards are that, first and foremost, I do not like them. I want my games to be as much as possible entirely on the cartridge or entirely on the disc. That's why I buy physical games. That's why I will always buy physical games. I want to be able to plug my game into any console in 20 or 30 years and still be able to play it as if I didn't even have or need the internet. That is important to me. And that is not how these game key cards or these other disc-based games that do this work. So I don't like them. However, I can admit that for certain games, certain franchises, certain companies who make certain kinds of games, in a world where things are going digital only and Game Pass and subscription services are dominating how people are spending their money and buying and playing their games, I have to say that I prefer the game key card concept to something that is digital only. And that is because they can be lent to people, they can be borrowed, they can be sold, they can be purchased used. And the general way that we've been operating with physical games over the decades still technically is present with a game key card. So it's complicated for me in the sense that there are games and maybe even franchises that I would buy on a full physical cartridge or disc, but that I won't buy on a game key card. I'm going to have to be a little bit more choosy with game key card releases, and there will be a lot of games that a lot of you companies out there would make that I would normally buy and give you my money for, but if you put it on a game key card, even if Nintendo forced your hand with the 64 gig thing, I will not buy your game because it's not physical. But of course, on the flip side, there are some games or franchises where yes, I would be willing to say, you know what, at least I get something physical. I would be willing to buy that game on a game key card. In fact, I'll even share with you a recent example that just came out a week ago. And it's this bad boy. Doom the Dark Ages. Look at this. This is a physical PlayStation 5 version of Doom the Dark Ages. And while it doesn't have Nintendo's transparent messaging of game key card, it does have, you can see it there. Can you see it? It's basically, where am I at? It is right here. It says internet required because yes, when I put this disc into my PlayStation 5, I basically had to download 99.9% of the game from the internet to my console. But it is still physical. I love Doom. I'm not going to miss the newest Doom game if they make something like this. I had to go to a physical store, GameStop, a place where they sell physical games, to buy this physical case of Doom the Dark Ages with a physical disc. I mean, look, it sucks that I had to download it, but I still have a disc, and I can lend this to a friend, which I'm going to once I beat it, by the way, because he wants to play it, and it's too expensive for him. So I'm going to lend this to a buddy, like in the next week, for him to play, and if I choose to sell this in the future and trade it into GameStop, I can do it, because there is still a disc that can be used, even though it needs a stupid server from the stupid internet to play on my PS5, or to download to my PS5, I should say. It still ultimately is something that requires something physical. So for certain franchises and certain games that I really want, if something like this exists and you can pretend I'm holding a Switch 2 game key card that I wanted, look, man, I'm going to be willing to do it because it's still real. And as long as they keep those stupid servers up, anyone can put my Doom disc in their PlayStation 5 and play it and download it to their console. And you don't need the internet long term to access the game. You just need it to download it the initial time. And then your internet could go kaput, but you could still put the disc in and play the game on your PlayStation. Just like with Switch 2 game key cards. It's not ideal. I don't love it, but it's a better compromise than buying Doom Dark Ages for $70 digitally. What a waste of money that would be. And I don't use Game Pass, so I'm not going to rent the game for $280 annually either on Game Pass. This, to me, is a worthy compromise for a few select games and franchises. Right now, the only confirmed game key card for the Switch 2 that I know I will be buying, even though I don't like game key cards, is going to be the Duskbloods, because I love From Software. I love the Demons and Dark Souls games. I love Bloodborne. I love Elden Ring. This is their new IP in that universe, using that engine and gameplay style. It's exclusive to the Switch 2, so I have no other options. I'm actually glad it's exclusive to the Switch 2. It looks fantastic. And so, yeah, that's an example of a game that I am willing to buy, even though I know it's a game key card, because at least I have something physical. I can sell it or lend it to a friend down the road if I want to, and I get something real for a game that I'm willing to buy the compromised version for. On the flip side, I've been considering Street Fighter 6 or the Yakuza game that's coming to Switch 2, because I've never really been interested in Yakuza, but I'm like, maybe I would play it for my Switch 2 because I'll be hungry for new games to play on my Switch 2. But both of those games, Street Fighter and Yakuza, they're game key cards. So you know what? If they were physically on a cartridge, I would probably buy them. Since they're game key cards, those are examples of the kinds of games where I'm going to not buy them. So Capcom and Sega, you are missing out on my money for those games because you didn't put them on a real, actual cartridge. I gotta buy a game key card. I don't want a game key cards for those. The Duskbloods, I need that game. I'll make the compromise. Those games, I'm not making the compromise for those. So this is just my approach, man. These are my complicated feelings. I'm willing to draw certain lines as need be for whatever the game is, whatever the company or the developer is. When it comes to Nintendo games, it's also going to be true. You know, I think a game like a new Kirby game or a new Xenoblade game that would come out, and if those came out and were confirmed to be game key cards, I'm not going to buy those. I would pass, and I would hate to do it, but I would pass on those. Now, if a new Mario game or Zelda game or Metroid game or a Star Fox game or an F-Zero game or a Pikmin game, if any of those came out and they were game key cards, I would be super upset. But sure, I would make the compromise for those franchises and those IPs. So there are lines that I'm willing to draw when it comes to the game key cards. And I know with Nintendo, it seems like a moot point because as far as we know, Nintendo will never use game key cards for their first party stuff. But I'm still trying to use an example of franchises and IPs that I do love where I will draw the line and I will not support the game key card. I mean, you know, they've got us by the nuts, man. Let's just be real. I don't love that the Switch 2 era is moving into this form of physical media with the game key cards, but it is what it is, and I'd rather have this than digital only, okay? Because look, man, if they made a Mario game that was digital only, I don't think I would buy that. And that's Mario. If all of Nintendo's IPs, or if their Switch 3 all goes digital only, I talked about this in this video, other than Metroid, I don't know that I'm going to be able to support that. I'm not going to buy a digital-only Switch 3. I'm not going to buy digital-only Mario games and Smash Brothers games. I just won't do it. But game key cards for some of those franchises, yeah, maybe. I think the last thing I want to talk about and leave you guys with here is another important element that I think people haven't really talked about, which is the game key card controversy, I think is unique in the sense that I actually think it's louder and more divisive simply because Nintendo is so transparent about what they're doing. They're more transparent about the game key cards than any other prior company, looking even at Doom, a game that's only a week old, has ever been. Doom just has this little internet required thing, and the internet also had to sniff out the fact that basically none of the game is on the disc here and you're downloading it through the internet, right? It's not something that Bethesda was like transparent about really, other than like putting this little thing right here. Whereas Nintendo in the Switch 2 era for game key cards, they are just throwing so much text and warning and labels all over the front of their boxes that are game key cards. They made a little video talking about it. They have been very openly transparent about what they are, which is a good thing. And we want our game companies to be transparent about their business practices, you guys, even the bad ones. Better to be transparent than to try to sneak one by on the consumer and the gamer. So it's a weird scenario where being so transparent has actually come around to biting Nintendo in the ass. And so it's put a larger spotlight on what they're doing than what's been happening with stuff like Doom and all these other games over the years that have been doing the same thing. Because they're not as transparent about it. They're not totally hiding it because the information is available online, and they do put this little thing right here in the corner. So it's there, but Nintendo doesn't do this. They're splashing the whole front of their game boxes with the warnings about a game key card. So it's a catch-22 where they're being transparent in the exact way game companies should be and that we expect them to be. And we should thank them for being transparent. However, the thing they're transparent about sucks. We should not thank them for even doing the game key cards in the first place. We should instead be demanding that they make a variety of sizes of cartridges available so these third-party companies cannot have to rely on game key cards. So again, the whole thing is messy. It is complicated, as is the title of this video and the nature of my feelings. It's all very complicated. In my opinion, it's not completely black and white. I understand that it's black and white for a lot of people, and I don't blame anyone who feels that way, because I hate this. I hate that we have to even approach the Switch 2 with this in mind, but we do. And so my complicated feelings and my unique approach is exactly as I've laid out in this video. There are some games that I'll make the compromise for, and I'll buy the game key card, just like I did with Doom. And there are a lot of games and a lot of IPs that I will say, you know what, I'm going to pass on it. I would buy it if it was completely physical, but I'm not going to buy it as a game key card because I want to be very choosy with when I choose to support this practice that I don't like with my money. Even though it is a decent compromise by giving us something physical that can be traded in, as I've said many times in this video. So I think I've said what I need to say. I think I've said my piece. Like I said, it's a messy topic. It's a complicated topic. It's a divisive and controversial topic. And so I've done my best to navigate the waters and navigate this conversation with you guys. I hope it makes sense. There's really no right or wrong way to feel about this. To me, the only thing I feel passionately about is that we shouldn't support a digital-only future, and we shouldn't support the subscription model future. Those are the things that I think we should be drawing our lines on. The game key cards, the internet-required Doom-like games for the other consoles, they suck, but there's a worthy compromise for the right titles to be found in there. So anyway, that's how I feel. I think I've emptied my head of these thoughts. Share your approach and your topics below, or your thoughts below. I know it's going to be spicy in the comments, but it is what it is. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.